Growth doesn't always look like growth. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like sitting in your car for 10 minutes after you get home. Not because you're tired, but because you finally need a moment that belongs to no one else. Sometimes it looks like staring at a message, typing a response, deleting it, and putting the phone face down on the table. And you don't even realize what just happened. You think you did nothing, but you did something that an older version of you never could. You paused. And that pause, the one you barely noticed, that's the whole point. Sometimes improvement feels like exhaustion, like you're doing all this work that nobody sees. You're catching yourself mid-reaction. You're swallowing words that would have felt good to say, but terrible to live with. You're choosing the harder option over and over. And at the end of the day, you sit down and think, I don't feel any better. If anything, you feel heavier, more aware, more drained. And you confuse that weight with failure. But it's not failure. It's what growth actually feels like before it becomes visible. Nobody told you it would feel like this because everybody talks about the results of growth. Nobody talks about the process. And the process feels like carrying something you can't put down and can't show anyone. You don't notice change when you live inside it. That's the cruelest part. You don't get a notification. There's no before and after photo for emotional maturity. There's no moment where the music swells and you realize you've become a different person. You just wake up one Tuesday and someone says something that would have ruined your entire week a year ago. And this time you just breathe. You let it go. And you move on so naturally that you don't even register what just happened. You don't think, wow, look at me, I've grown. You just go make coffee. But that moment, the one that didn't ruin your day, that's everything. That's the evidence. You just stopped looking for it because it didn't come with fireworks. Most people are improving right now and have absolutely no idea. They think they're stuck. They think they're behind. They look at other people's lives and think everyone else has cracked some code they missed. But here's what's actually happening. The people who feel the most stuck are often the ones who've grown the most, because growth raises your standards, and higher standards make the gap between where you are and where you want to be feel enormous, even when you've already crossed more than half the distance. You moved the finish line. That's why you feel behind. Not because you haven't moved, but because your definition of enough keeps evolving. And that's not a flaw. That's ambition wearing the disguise of inadequacy. Here's something that would change a lot of people's lives if they really understood it. Progress doesn't feel like progress. It feels like frustration, feels like restlessness. It feels like this quiet, low-level hum of dissatisfaction that you can't quite explain to anyone. You're not miserable exactly, you're just not content. And you think that means something's wrong with you. But it doesn't. It means something's shifting. It means your tolerance for the old way of living is shrinking. Your body is rejecting a life that used to fit you, like a shoe that was comfortable last year and now pinches in ways you can't ignore. That's not stagnation. That's your system telling you you've outgrown the container. If you've been feeling like you're putting in effort but nothing's changing, I need you to stay here for a while. Because I think by the end of this, something's going to click. And it might catch you off guard, because you've already changed. You just haven't given yourself credit for it yet. The reason is simple and painful. You're comparing yourself to an imagined future version of who you think you should be by now, not your actual past. You're measuring the distance between where you are and some fantasy version of yourself who has it all figured out, who's calm all the time, who never struggles, who wakes up at 5 and journals and meditates and never loses their temper. And that person doesn't exist. Not for you, not for anyone. But because you're measuring against this fiction, every real version of yourself falls short. And you think the problem is you, but the problem is the ruler. You're using the wrong measurement. If you turned around and measured how far you've come instead of how far you have to go, you'd be stunned. I mean, actually stunned. Think about it. Truly think about it. A year ago, you would have handled certain situations completely differently. You would have said things you didn't mean, and then spent 3 days trying to clean up the mess. You would have stayed in conversations that drained you because you were terrified of the silence that would follow if you left. You would have chased people who clearly weren't choosing you, and then blamed yourself when they kept proving it. You would have taken things so personally that other people's bad days became your emotional emergencies. But now you catch yourself. Not every time, but more than before. And that shift, that tiny shift from automatic reaction to momentary awareness, that's not a small thing. That's a complete rewiring of how you function as a person. You just don't see it because it happened in fractions, day by day, thought by thought, one caught impulse at a time. There's this thing that happens when you grow emotionally that nobody prepares you for. You start noticing your own patterns in real time. You're mid-argument, and suddenly this voice in the back of your head says, "You've done this before. You know exactly where this goes. You know the script." And 2 years ago, that voice wasn't there. You'd be fully absorbed. No distance, no awareness, just pure, unfiltered reaction. Now, there's a gap between the trigger and the response. And in that gap is everything. That's where maturity lives. Not in the response itself, in the gap. The space where you could react, but you choose. And choosing, even when you choose wrong, is completely different from reacting. Reacting is unconscious. Choosing is growth. But here's what nobody warns you about. Awareness doesn't feel like a superpower. It feels like a curse, because once you see your patterns, you can't unsee them. Once you recognize that you argue because you're scared, not because you're right, that knowledge follows you everywhere. You bring it into every conversation, every relationship, every quiet moment alone. And carrying that kind of self-knowledge is heavy. It's like suddenly being able to hear a frequency no one else can. You see the mechanics behind your own behavior, and it doesn't feel liberating. It feels exhausting. And you start wondering, was I happier before I knew all this? Was I better off being oblivious? And honestly, maybe. Ignorance is lighter. It always will be. But awareness is richer. You traded comfort for clarity, and that trade doesn't feel good at first. It feels like loss. But it's not. It's one of the most valuable trades you'll ever make. You just won't appreciate it until later. Much later. Let me walk you through some signs, and I'm not going to list them like a checklist because this isn't that kind of conversation. I want you to sit with each one. Let it land. Because I think some of these are going to feel uncomfortably specific, like I somehow know what your last Thursday looked like. You react slower than you used to. That's a sign. Remember how you used to fire back immediately? Someone says something that stings, and within seconds you had a response locked and loaded, surgical, designed to wound. Now there's a pause. Maybe 2 seconds, maybe an hour, maybe a full day where you sit with it before deciding if it even deserves a reply. That pause didn't used to exist, and you might think it means nothing, but that pause is everything. That pause is your nervous system learning for the first time to not treat every uncomfortable moment as a 5-alarm emergency. That's not passivity, that's regulation, the kind that took thousands of small, invisible decisions to build. You argue less, and not because you've lost your spine, not because you've given up, but because you've realized that most arguments aren't about truth. They're about ego, and you've gotten quietly, deeply tired of feeding yours. You used to need the last word like oxygen. You used to build entire courtroom closing arguments in your head while the other person was still mid-sentence. Now you just let it go. Not because you agree, but because your peace has become more expensive to you than being right. And most people aren't paying your price. There was a version of you, not even that long ago, who would have sent a full paragraph in response to a 2-sentence provocation. An essay, really. Every receipt, every timeline, every grievance organized chronologically with evidence. And now you send 1 sentence, or nothing. You just read the message, put the phone down on the table, and go about your day. Old you would call that weakness. But old you was exhausting. Old you spent more energy proving points than building a life. And the fact that you can now read something that would have consumed you for days and just shrug, that's not apathy. That's graduation. You've moved on from needing to be understood by everyone to understanding yourself. And that's a completely different level. There's also the way you handle your phone now. This one's subtle, but it says everything. You used to sleep with it inches from your face. You used to check it the second your eyes opened. Every notification felt urgent. Every unanswered message felt like a crisis. Now you leave it in the other room sometimes. You see missed calls and don't panic. You read messages and respond when you're ready, not when anxiety tells you to. That shift didn't happen in a day. That was months of slowly teaching yourself that you are not on call for the entire world, that your attention is not a public resource, that your peace is not a luxury, it's a priority. And anyone who makes you feel guilty for protecting it is telling you exactly why you need to. You apologize faster now. And this one surprises people because it sounds like it shouldn't be a sign of strength. The old you would have held out, would have waited for the other person to crack first, would have turned a simple apology into a chess game where whoever said sorry first lost a piece. Now you just say it, not because you're weak, but because you finally learned something that takes most people decades to learn. Being right and being at peace aren't always the same thing, and you've decided that peace pays better. That's not submission. That's strategy, the highest form of it.